we're going to start with a description of what is energy healing, followed by some moments of silence, prayer of gratitude, little recap from yesterday, and then into today's session. And as promised, I'm going to mostly focus on questions and lots of requests for different healings and stuff. So anyway, that's where we are. Thank you all. What is energy healing? Energy healing is taking awareness down under the surface. Like symptoms show up at the surface. Healing is needed. Healing is needed because something's going wrong at the surface. But energy healing is a method of diving down underneath the surface with awareness, taking awareness down deep under the surface in order to dig into the core or the root of the problem, and to use consciousness to address that core or root of the problem. The core or root, when you dive in, when I say dive in, I mean go to more abstract, more fine, more less concrete levels of the problem. And those levels we find are just made of mostly energy, consciousness, and lots of ways to describe all of that anyway, and to understand and experience it, because being able to know the landscape, being able to kind of know the lay of the land and know how to describe the lay of the land really helps a lot in getting awareness right into the part that needs to be addressed and addressing it most effectively. So, and as you all know, it's really obvious on the surface to know where the boundaries are, right? Like I'm this tall and I'm this wide and so and so. But when you start diving awareness under the material boundaries of creation, we come into this abstract field, and in the abstract field, boundaries are less obvious, and landmarks. And it's not that the landmarks are actually less obvious, but they're not, because they're not physical material, we're not necessarily used to them. So a lot of what I'm offering in these live webinars and also in all of my other programs is a roadmap, basically just a roadmap for kind of finding your way around that. Because in the end, my desire, hopefully, is also your desire, which is that all of us become very greatly self-sufficient in our ability to deal with and cope with our own problems and situations and issues. And we all know, I'm sure everybody at some point or another has had the experience of some symptom crops up at the surface, and you know that there was something that was really bothering you emotionally or mentally or somewhere deep inside. You know it. And you wonder, there's always that suspicion, I wonder if that thing that was really bothering me mentally and emotionally somehow contributed to the symptom that I'm having. And the answer is probably yes. And the answer is also therein lies the solution. So energy healing is about that. Energy healing is about getting in and working with the underlying elements that give rise to problems on the surface. And that doesn't mean that we discount Western medicine, because Western medicine is a great way of bringing forth the physical material influences that will help also bring about a good result. But we all know that for some people, the Western medicine works really well, and for others, it doesn't work so well, right? So why is it? And I was talking to someone who was a nurse the other day, and she was saying, yeah, that was her experience her whole life, is that people would come in and they'd all, there were standard procedures that were used for different illnesses, and some people would respond really well to them and others really wouldn't. And if you're the kind of person, well, let's say we all respond differently at different times to different procedures or medications or whatever. But the point is that if you pay off the underlying karma, if you work with the subtle levels of the imbalance, then that it helps to set a condition in the physiology that makes it a lot easier for whatever policies or procedures or whatever it is that we then use, like say healthy eating habits or exercise and rest or whatever we do, then we'll have a better effect overall for the physiology. So they can all work together. And the other side of that is that eventually the energy healing becomes potent enough that the Western medicine isn't so much needed, right? That a lot of times one will find, well, I went and I eliminated the underlying issue that was behind the symptom, and then what do you know, the symptom went away. And that's really common. It's common, and it's good for that to happen. And yeah, sometimes the thing about that happening is that it happens, it's a very organic process. When the healing happens like that, it's very organic, and it will tend to take its time. And the value of Western medicine is it can come in, it'll just, do its thing really quickly, kind of blasts past a lot of the finer details of the experience, but it does come in and it gets things done, especially if you are on a time frame. So it is. Okay. That's my description of what is energy healing. Let's take about 3 minutes to sit quietly in the silence of being, in the deep inner silence, allowing awareness to go inward. I will ask you to close the eyes. Well, I'll ask you to close the eyes and I'll go on mute and open my clock. And when it's time, 3 minutes, don't mind the time, and I'll let you know when it's time. And then when I suggest time to open the eyes, please take as much comfortable time as you need to open the eyes in a way that allows you to bring that inner silence with you out into the field of experience. All right, let's close our eyes. All right. Take your time before opening the eyes. Thank you to the source of creation for being everything. Thank you for being all of us and all the universe. Thank you for being the immeasurably precious connection between the unmanifest absolute ocean of totality and the entire universal field of its expression. Thank you for being this webinar, that this every moment of this webinar may be blessed in its usefulness and value and meaning and potential to lead each person here forward on their own path to their own highest healing potential. Thank you to all of you for being with me. I'm so grateful to get to be the voice of our collective. I'm so grateful for the trust that you've put in me, and I hope that I can always rise to that trust and rise to that vision and provide the best possible quality experience that I can from my side. Thank you. Okay, so is it accessing? Yeah, accessing infinite potential. Recap from yesterday. We talked about potential a lot and the origins of potential and the locations of potential. And we did some, diving in and focusing and finding our potential and getting sort of clued into and understanding the nature of personal potential versus collective potential, and some nice discussion regarding how potential itself evolves, how it evolves by expanding into the range of its field of expression, expanding into its range. And I really enjoyed bringing up the example from Dr. Michael Levin, I guess they say Levin, Dr. Michael Levin, who one of our dear participants put me on 2 years ago, and I have been such a big fan of his work ever since. And his amazing descriptions of how life and consciousness evolve hand in hand, and how individuals, like every particle of our creation and every particle of us, are made up of collectives of individuals, essentially. And we are also individuals within a collective, and how the evolution of potential is essential, and the evolution of form too, like the evolution of individuals and life is to a certain degree, at least this is the way I understand. He's very smart. He's like smarter than me, but to a certain degree, the way I understand it is that's an outgrowth of the way we interact with the process of unity or unification, because we connect with one another. Just like somewhere way back in the soup, one little cell over here decided, and another little cell thought, hey, maybe we would be stronger together. And they came together, and the birth of multicelled organisms began. And it's interesting, I was thinking just a little bit more about that this morning, how when organisms come together in a collective, it supports their individual evolution, but it also then gives rise to this form that has its own potential to evolve. So then all of a sudden you go from like a bunch of different proteins molecules floating around in a plasma-like soup, and they form together and they create a cell. And the cell is like somehow greater than the sum of its parts, right? The cell has its own cell consciousness. And then the individual cells are floating around, and eventually they come together and they create, an organism with multiple cells in it. And that organism has its own organism consciousness, which is greater than even the sum of all the cells within it, and so forth. And one of the things I realized is that working together in a system like that requires a good understanding of new sets of boundaries, right? When the cell is over here floating around on its own, it's got certain boundaries and limitations that it has to function within, but it realizes, hey, I can overcome some of the limitations that I'm facing by working together with other cells, and we can become a multi-celled organism, and we can do more together. But then within the constraints of being a multi-celled organism, there are also boundaries, because if you're a cell in a multi-celled organism and you decide, oh, no, I'm going to go rogue, I'm going rogue, and you decide to be a rogue cell, in that you suddenly like separate yourself, at least on the level of consciousness, you separate yourself from the rest of the organism. That's how cancer cells are made. That's what makes cancer. That's what cancer cells are. They're cells in a person's body that are individual cells that got this great idea or they somehow experienced on some level that that they were just going to like do their own thing. And when the cell within the system like that, when it's been kind of accepted into a system, and when it's become integrated into a system, and then it decides, oh, hey, now I'm just going to go do my own thing, then it starts to exploit the system in which it exists. And that's not good for the system. The very reason for being in the system is then discounted. But in order to stay in the system, all the cells have to follow the rules of the system, right? You have a little bit, if you're a single cell over here floating around in the plasma and another one over here, you got plenty of room to move anywhere. You just move anywhere you want. But if you become part of a multi-celled system, there's less room. And you have to figure out where your spot where is your place in that lineup of cells, and then kind of get in your spot and then kind of stay in your spot, right? So there are limitations also and boundaries at each step of that evolutionary process. And I was really looking at those today and kind of working to kind of wrap my mind around the nature of how boundaries look different at different levels of expansion. But that could be a discussion for another day, because today we're talking about accessing our potential. But I just wanted to kind of let you know where the evolution of thought had been going since yesterday, because, as usual, your light shines in and it really helps me. And then I see things more. And so anyway, I'm just going to take a drink. As those of you who were with me yesterday know, I have been through a period of illness that was very intense, and I'm still coming out of it. So that's the cold tea from yesterday. Okay. So as promised, oh, and I should open my question and answer box too. As promised, I wanted to, oh, no questions. Amazing. Oh, no, not like that. Let's try that one more time. I would look at some of the questions from yesterday, because questions so good and so important and so necessary to answer. Okay, so here's a question. Is the gap the same as the divine, God, silence, and grace, where we create? This is a wonderful question for this webinar. If so, can you bring us there to that space in this webinar so we can all experience it? All right. So to answer the first part of the question, this is really what the webinar is about. And yesterday I got so lost talking about potential that I didn't really get into this really important part of, or I'd say the ultimate intention that I had months ago when I made up the idea for this webinar, was to really look at the mechanics of the gap, really look at how consciousness goes into the gap and how it interacts and self-interacts in that space in order to make those subtle changes that are required to give rise to different results at the surface of life. So we have kind of three factors here. Actually four, but but let's just look at it as three. We have the silent, infinite, unbounded ocean of pure, unmanifest being. And that's the resource. It's the ultimate resource from where everything comes. All the intelligence, wisdom, creativity, and energy, but also all the other resources. Everything gives rise to anything that we would consider a resource, you know. So energy coming up in many forms, matter coming up in many forms. I'm going to try one more drink of this. Oh my God. Oh, sorry. Okay. So, um, so there's that. There's that infinite, unbounded Brahman, no thingness, no thingness. Then there is no thingness is all that is. It is totality. And so nothing can be created but from that. So it interacts with itself. Basically, it starts to fold into it. There's a pulse that takes place in the no thingness, whereby it goes back and forth between being completely like cocooning, like that's a new word I learned while I was sick, cocooning, like kind of folded in on its own nature, versus being kind of puffed up and ready to pounce into action, but still not having pounced anywhere, so still no thingness. And an oscillation of awareness goes back and forth between those two values. And the oscillation literally manifests the gap. It's that very, very slightest of all movements that happens in the relationship between the kind of cocooning stage and the like, maybe I should like go somewhere stage. Maybe I'm awake. I'm awake. I know I'm awake. So that sort of is the beginning where the no thingness within its own nature, because it's got this ability to be aware, it is aware, then it becomes aware that it's got different ways that awareness shows. And it's the interaction between those different ways that awareness shows that gives rise to the aggregation of material form and in you know, coming out from it. The gap is different. The gap is the word used to describe the point where a shift occurs between the no thingness and the actual first tenderest sproutings of expression. As I said, as I mentioned, those come from this oscillation that's occurring deep within the silence of absolute being. Okay, so the gap is the junction point between something that can be known and defined and understood and recognized and described and something that cannot. It's not that the no thingness cannot be known. It can't be known in that it can't be understood intellectually, but it can be experienced directly. The gap can be known and understood and broken down and analyzed. So the gap is different. And then the third thing mentioned in this question was God. And where is God? And what part of that is God? And the answer is God is essentially that totality that is greater than the sum of the parts. So remember the cells, right? And when they're individual cells, they're like greater than the sum of the parts of the molecules. But when they form together, then they create a multi-celled organism that has its own consciousness that's greater than the sum of the parts of the consciousness of each individual cell and so forth. Well, you can think of that as like the largest form in the universe. And it includes all of the field of nothingness, and it includes all of the field of manifest form, and includes absolutely everything. And it is yet greater than that. It is yet greater than that. Because, yeah, because that's the way creation is. As I understand it, as I offer it to you. So we've got kind of, I was saying we have three things. When I said, well, maybe we have four things, as like I was thinking, well, we could count the manifest field of creation as its own thing, as its own separate thing. But really, when you get to that point where God is the greater than the sum of the totality of all that is not and all that is and all this moving and unmoving universe and so forth, then it's only one thing. There really is only one thing at that point. So 3 and 1, 3 and 1. We come back to that principle that the whole creation is built on this foundation of three things and one thing that is the totality of the three, and yet it is also the three. So I guess we put the no thing, the gap, and the manifest field as three, and then God is like the larger than the sum total of all of those, and all of it's God. So the last part of her question is where we create, and that's just the most luscious part of that question, because where we create is in the gap. The creation springs, it springs forth from the no thingness, and the springing happens in the gap. Like that's where springing occurs. And when things aren't springing nicely in the material field, then bringing awareness into the gap is the key to addressing the springing process not springing properly. So that's really what I wanted this webinar to be about. So I thank the lady who sent this amazing question, because this is what this webinar really is about, is bringing awareness into that gap and looking at how the awareness, the different like little steps that occur as the awareness falls into the gap and then comes back out of the gap. Because when in energy healing, what we're doing is we're taking a symptom or a problem, and we're carrying, we're like drawing or riding, awareness rides on a thread of its own nature down to the source, down to the gap. And so the problem is kind of like it comes with you in a way. You know, something is not correct, something is not right. So we bring it, we bring the awareness. We say, this thing is not correct. So I'm going to bring my awareness in, and I'm looking at that thing that seems so glaring on the surface of life, but I'm looking at it in a more abstract way, in a more refined way, in a more broad, comprehensive way, until we get down into the gap. And then there's like a little flop at the end where the awareness that's a long journey, right? So the awareness takes a little rest in the silence of absolute being. And in that resting phase is rejuvenated and revitalized and imbued with resources required to deal with the issue at hand. And then as the awareness reemerges from the gap, it reemerges fresh, it reemerges new, it reemerges in a way that informs the fundamental scaffolding. And that's when I say that, I'm talking about the subtle expressions of consciousness that are behind the manifest field of creation. So it informs that subtle scaffolding, how to show up so that the surface expression comes out better. That's basically the mechanic of it. That's the mechanic. It absolutely involves you could say like the magic part of the step is that flop at the end when the awareness comes to it is so charming. It's like, I remember one time my own teacher describing it like a little child running into the arms of mother. The closer he gets, the faster he runs, because that source of creation energy is just so beautiful. It's so charming. It's so attractive that, and of course, if there's suffering at the surface, that's like so unattractive and so like you don't even want to be there. So, you know, as the awareness grabs up the issues of the symptom of suffering and starts to dive in, the closer one gets to that source of creation, the faster the movement is, because that's where the ease in grace and comfort and lies deep inside. So Yeah, that last little flop is becomes a moment of surrender without even feeling like you're giving up anything, because you aren't. In a sense, one is giving up some relative material aspect or experience for the experience of totality, which is not giving up anything. It's not giving up anything. And then that's where the magic happens, if you want to call it magic. But we like to analyze things, don't we? So that, I mean, that's one of the purpose, that's one of the reasons I offer these energy healing workshops, is that if we can actually look at what's going on and understand it and be able to put words to it, then it makes that part of the process more accessible. So the awareness flops into the ocean of being, and there's a kind of a thy will be done kind of, there's a kind of surrender that occurs at that moment of just letting go and saying, okay, I'm more comfortable here anyway. So awareness gets to go into the silence and enjoy the silence. Enjoy the silence. And this brings me to another question, because I want to keep going on this idea, but I want to bring it and make it like a little more, like a little more practical level. So here we go. This is one of the questions that came in last night. This sweet woman said, I've been putting awareness on the black hole within me, the Kali perhaps, for years. Is it because it sits at a level that is bigger than the light of my individual consciousness that I am unable to transmute it? Your individual consciousness in its full potential is the totality. It is the totality. It is the totality. The black hole, remember how a big system is like, has its own consciousness that's like larger than the sum of the parts. For a lot of us, and I bet I wouldn't be surprised out there, you guys, if there are other people here, because I know I've experienced this too. Excuse me. I'm going to be coughing, by the way, just letting you know from time to time. And then maybe I'll take a drink of this tea. Anyway, um, where the black hole is sort of like, because I'm looking into it energetically also, this lady's specific experience, that it becomes the sum total. What she's done is she's taken all the little bits and pieces and parts and particles of her own nature that are not completely integrated, that are not a perfect expression of totality, that are not godlike, right? And they've kind of worked their way together to create a little sort of entity, you could say, a little expression of self that is greater, where the consciousness of it is greater than the sum of the parts. And that's why it seems big and it seems hard to wrap awareness around. Because just as the first multi-celled organisms began billions of years, what is it? Was it like 3.5 billion years ago? It was about 3.5 billion years ago, the first organisms began, and shortly thereafter, the first multi-celled organisms began. The multi-celled organism is bigger than each of the cells individually, even added up. You could take those, say it's a multi-celled organism of 16 cells. And if you have all the 16 cells and you kind of clump them together, you still have 16 individual cell consciousnesses. But if they know that they are together, if they intend to be together, if they choose their togetherness and they all adhere to the same boundaries and limitations, we could call them like we conform to social boundaries, right? We as people, I have clothes on, guys, right? Because, there's social boundaries here, right? I mean, just simple, obvious. The social boundaries, then that form suddenly kicks into a higher level of consciousness and expression, and it realizes I am a multi-celled being with 16 cells in me, and I can do stuff. I can eat. I can tell this cell to be part of the digestion. I'll make that cell be my eye, and all of a sudden, you've got a whole new reality going on. And that can happen for people. That can happen inside of us sometimes with our stresses. It also happens with the light. And this is one of the reasons why we create a system of understanding the energy healing process, because part of the story of defining the parts of ourself and defining the aspects of our consciousness that heal, and saying, okay, I've got these archetypal forms that are part of my healing structure, and I've got these fundamentals of being that are part of my structure, and they're the richas, and I've talked a lot about those in the previous the three gunas and all that. Oh, thank you. Multicellular life started about 1.5 billion years ago. Thank you so much, multicellular. So it was like the very earliest beginnings were like 3.5. Life itself. Yes, I thought it was. Maybe it was after that. Anyway, 1.5 billion's a lot of years. And so we'll just go with that. We'll go with the 1.5 billion. Thank you so much, my dear. Anyway, when that happens, here's another example. A person experiences a trauma, and the trauma impacts them in a sort of holistic manner, right? So say the trauma is so great that the body produces a lot of neurochemicals that are stress, like cortisol and blood lactate in the blood and different kind of stress hormones, okay, and chemicals. And those chemicals flood into the body, and a little piece of those chemicals goes in every single cell of the body. And the stress is severe enough that in the person's life, the stress doesn't just leave the cells of the body. It kind of stays there like a little inside of every cell, a little twist inside of every cell. And then eventually, when the stress decides it's time to leave, it has to come out of every single cell. And when it does that, it has, some of the cells had eye consciousness in them, and some of the cells had liver consciousness in them, and some of the cells were, stomach consciousness and muscle consciousness and bone consciousness and hair consciousness, like that. And so the cells come, the stress as it emerges, each little piece of that stress emerges with also a little piece of a sort of sense of identity associated with the different parts of the body where it was. And you can get a stress that emerges from the body that has a kind of it's like larger than the sum of the parts, right? That has intention. And I don't know if I ever told this experience before, but I had such a stress come out of me. One time I was in my 20s and on a deep meditation retreat type of program where I was, looking to get rid of those types of stresses. And the nightmare, it was in the middle of the summer, and the nightmare that I was in a subway and there'd been an accident in the subway and there were so many people were killed, and I was supposed to clean up. My job was to clean up. So I had like these body bags, and I was trying, and I came to a body bag and there was a body in it, and I looked inside and the body was my body. And I was like, oh my God, that's like freaking me out, And I kind of woke up in a sort of sweat in a way, like, oh my God, just what was that? And in the air, in my bedroom, I felt this sort of sense of absolute horror and disgust and horrified that was with me in the dream, right? That there were feelings in the dream and they were still with me, like very present. And it almost felt like kind of oppressive. And it was a windless night. It was a windless night and my windows were open. And then the glass in my windows started to buzz. The way the glass buzzes when the windows are shut tight and the air is trying to squeeze through the window, that is what my windows were doing. But they were not closed and there was in fact, I could hear a train in the distance, like there was no wind. So how is it that my windows started to buzz? I knew that it was like there was a presence. There was something there that was ultra creepy. I didn't know what it was. And it seemed scary. And I had such a feeling of like all the feelings, the dread and the the horror and just the trauma and all that went with it, I finally got up the courage to jump out of my bed and like run out of my room as quickly as I could. And I did it. And I was because I was in a retreat, there were a lot of other ladies in the other rooms. Of course, this is like the middle of the night, like 1:30 or 2 or something in the morning. But I went and timidly tapped on the door of one of the ladies because I was one of the youngest ones. And she came out and we had a lovely long talk about night experiences and night terrors and all kinds of things like that. And she was so dear. She went in and she said, she gave me practical tips. So if anything like that ever happens to you, practical tips. Also, babies will often, it's really common for babies to have really terrifying experiences at night if they're left alone, just saying. But anyway, and those are not unreal. Those are real things. But anyway, turn on the lights, light a candle, light some incense, shake out the sheets. And immediately things just lightened up beautifully. But the point is that was when I understood that stresses can do the same thing that consciousness itself does, which is they can band together and to create these sort of larger, darker forms of themselves, basically. And the principle here is, her question is it because it sits at a level that is bigger than the light of my individual consciousness? And the answer is yes. It sits at a level bigger than individual consciousness. But the other shoe that needs to drop on that statement is that you are also bigger than your individual consciousness. We are bigger than our individuality. And that was really what yesterday's session was all about, diving into the nature of one's pure potential, of one's infinite potential, and looking at what that means to have infinite potential, and how the infinite potential then it becomes, the more one works with one's potential, the more integrated it becomes, and thus the more it informs and guides every question and every choice, but also every thought and every feeling. And that night that I had that experience and I came to be able to define my experience, my dear friend is such a sweet lady, helped me define my experience because she'd been on other courses where similar had happened. Allowed me to expand what I knew my individual consciousness to be, so that such an experience would never set me off my rocker again, ever. And the reason for the gathering that happens for this lady, she's a very, very, very powerful woman who's already dealt with all kinds of just tremendous challenges in her life. And so she's overcome like huge challenges, but this is like another level of challenge. And that is that by gathering, kind of like quarantining, it's like you think, well, I can quarantine all that darkness into one place. And then by quarantining it there was enough intelligence there that it kind of banded together. Now, the interesting thing is that the darkness that forms, that type of darkness that forms, is born of a belief in separation. Interesting, right? Like it's those are the dark, it's every little place within us that thinks, I am not of the one. I am not part of God. I am not part of the whole. I am like a rogue cell, that's like, oh yeah, I'm living in the body, but I'm on my own out here and I'm just out for myself, my own best interests or whatever. So interestingly, it's interesting that those forms can band together like a little organized criminals or something, and have their own little collective, that all of the whole collective is built on this idea of, yeah, but I'm separate from the divine, and I'm out here just getting the best that I can and exploiting everything the best that I can and so forth. But there are lots of forms like that. And the force of life that stands behind addictions is one of those. Not that that's necessarily, that's not that this is what this lady is dealing with, but that force that's behind addictions is that. Because the force behind addictions can grab a person here and it can grab another person over here and another can just, it can grab infinite numbers of them. And it can live its life through all of those people that are like a parasite with many hosts. And then once it grabs one person, it uses the host as an instrument to create damage in the life, to exploit the entire field around that host. So everybody that host talks to or knows or loves or whatever gets, gets sort of sapped of their life force because of that addictive personality. It's interesting. So, and there are forms like that on Earth. They're big ones. And the Kali, she mentions Kali. Kali is another one of those forms. There are a lot of those forms on Earth that are so big that they, instead of sitting in like the one that came out of me that was in each one of my cells, they sit a little bit in everybody, in every one of us. And the reason that they're there is to inspire and drive us to come together in ever more unified and coherent groupings so that we create consciousness, big consciousness in ourself that can deal with those energies. Because as individuals, we can't deal with them. So partly what she's looking at is she's feeling this darkness in her, but it's not strictly of her. It's part of like a category or family of stress. You could call them stresses or impurities in our world that are kind of big. They're kind of big. And we feel them in us because each of us is carrying a little piece of it. And when we come together and we work together, we can eradicate. That's the way. And that's sort of like the driving force behind the evolutionary process to a degree that people, excuse me, excuse me, the driving force behind the evolutionary oh my goodness, I have to take another drink, sorry. Oh my goodness. It drives us. It drives us again and again to work collectively and to find our individual identity, like anchor into the larger totality of the universe and creation. Each of us has a point of anchor, and the point of anchor is your potential. So that's what the whole discussion of yesterday was about, is how the individual potential is like a link or an anchor to collective potential for evolution. Individual potential for evolution is the touch point, is the center or the point that connects us to the evolution of the whole creation. And I was saying how we're in these cycles, from like the cycles of the seasons, culturally though, we're in these cycles, and that empires rise and fall, and that those are laws of nature that are essentially running at a larger level of creation than us as individuals. And so if we're going to navigate through the fall, and we're actually, if we want to talk about the fall in terms of autumn's just about over, folks. We're like coming up on the winter. So if we want to navigate through the time of the cycle that is most challenging for us as a collective in a way that leverages the potential of the winter to reveal the scaffolding that's behind the forms of this empire and creation and this social structure, global social structure that we are creating, then we have to work together. Which brings me to another question, as promised, questions. This is from this exquisite woman in France. Thank you for being with me. Can we do a healing for peace? Her question is, can we do a healing for peace? The waves of war arise from the fundamental collective level, collective imbalance of a deep truth needing to surface and being camouflaged or covered up by illusion, falsehood, misinformation, disinformation. And when that's happening so big and so collective, and so many people cannot see from their individual perspective how to birth that truth, the pains begin. Really, it's all for the sake of opening a bigger truth, like a nut, cracking the nut open and pulling out the good stuff on the inside. Peace. Peace is the nutcracker. Peace is the implement that you reach in with. Because peace, the grace of God, peace is the place where awareness slides down. And same for Our Lady in the last part we were talking about, where the awareness slides down underneath that darkness. Peace is that energy of unification that allows the awareness to slip underneath, to slip into the gap, to slip into the very abstract, most abstract levels of consciousness where the resources are accessible. And that movement is such a delicate movement. It is the movement of peace. It's not, the situation isn't good, I'm going to go out there and start smashing skulls. It's the situation isn't good. And where is that softness? Where is that deepest softness of awareness that allows me to dig into the quiet center, the soft, quiet center of all solutions, so that the revealing of truth occurs in a manner which is dignified and honorable and worthy of all of us. It's worthy of us as a collective which is greater than the sum of its parts. Take a country that's very well established in its national identity, like, say, Israel. Very, very strong national identity. And put the challenge on that country, because that's the country that has a strong national identity. How will it respond? How will it I'm just feeling the movement of it. What happens is when the awareness goes in the gap, the seed of the imbalance is illuminated and identified. And then the seed of the imbalance in that state of illumination is imbued with the resources to grow. Some countries' national identity is every country has national identity based on something different. In America, here, our national identity is based on freedom. Like that's a thing in America about being free. But other national identities are based on other things. And in the end, all of the nations need to dive deeper and find a foundation for their national, all of us, the whole world, and find the national identity that is founded on the highest. The highest, which is the potential to be the most perfect expression of divinity possible. Evolution, 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 evolution. It's so easy to rest in the silence of being and to be the instrument for the flow of a solution. We can take that solution, not just, we don't just put it on one spot, but it goes to all the nations, to help all the nations find a common foundation for their national identity. And that doesn't mean that each nation doesn't still get to keep its unique characteristics and qualities, but when the foundation is the same, essentially the same foundation for all the different countries, then that is the thing that binds them together into a whole which is greater than the sum of the parts. Dropping into the silence of absolute being so that it can spring forth. Lots of shifting. You know, in order for that to happen, the individuals have to be there too, to a certain, at least a certain percentage of them have to be there. But that's okay. We're getting there. I think we're getting there. That was very interesting. Not what I was expecting, but very interesting. Okay. Is the flop necessarily a transcendent experience state, or would it be fair to say that you might feel the energy of your intention? I guess, is there a taste of bliss there? Oh, yes. Well, there's definitely the flop is the flop into the transcendental state. And yes, there's a taste of bliss in that flop. And part of the bliss is the feeling of letting go of something and also gaining something so much greater than what one let go of. You know, it's, do you know, in our brains, there's this little, the limbic system is where we process feelings and emotions, right? And one of the organs in there is called the caudate. And it's this thing, C-shaped, and it's maybe a little smaller than my fingers, but it's about that shape, like a C. It's shaped like a C. And at one end is the organ that experiences pleasure. And at the other end is the organ that experiences pain, the nucleus accumbens and the amygdala. And what happens is sometimes if you experience pain, that one activates. And sometimes if you experience pleasure, that one activates. But sometimes you experience something that makes them both activate at the same time. And that actually gives rise to an experience of intensity that we associate with the most profoundly transforming experiences in our life, like giving birth. Giving birth is intensely pleasurable and intensely painful at the same time. And it's like you never get over that. you know and there are many other examples as well. And so it's like that flop, that little flop, because you're just letting go of absolutely everything. And at this, on the same stroke, you're gaining absolutely everything and more, and all that is and all that is not. And it's absolutely a transcendental experience. I hope that answered your question. There is bliss. Thanks. It was a good question. The other side of that is, I think sometimes the letting go experience can be had anywhere all along that spectrum. The cycle of creation, it comes out of the absolute, and then there's the manifest form is created, and the manifest form undergoes this moment where it realizes, oh wow, I'm like not really able to hold all the light of being completely. So I need to reshape myself. And so it starts to collapse back in like that. And the letting go and letting go and letting go and letting go, like this, like the child running to the arms of its mother. When this child starts to run, somewhere it's already in mother's arms, right? It's like my mama right there, but it still goes faster as it gets closer. It's a beautiful question. I hope that helped. Is it energy of your intention? Even the intention is released. Even the intention, everything that could be defined or described or expressed in some way, it all goes and it's just wholeness. But the intention is important, because whatever that intention is, as the collapse is occurring, I'm having this horrible symptom and I want to feel better. Whatever that intention is, that like informs and influences the in the transition into the transcendent and back out again. We talked about that a lot yesterday with regards to going between lives. Thank you for that great question. Thanks for being here. When I get afraid, I start to pray to Holy Mother and remember the line from the Upanishads that there is nothing bigger than me. And I pray, let all beings be happy, blissful, and live in peace. Oh, can you tell the person who wrote that has a heart as big as the whole world? She really does. The thing about prayer is prayer necessarily creates a condition, the state of prayer creates a condition whereby that surrendering and surrendering and surrendering and surrendering is happening. I mean, well, prayer is very personal. I guess some people's prayers are different than others, but I think ideally I could, not being a theologian and not being an expert and not wanting to say anything that would be wrong here, but it seems that if a person chooses to pray or selects to pray, that just the choice to pray creates that condition of surrendering and giving back. And of course, Holy Mother, in the different traditions around the world, Holy Mother, Mother Divine, etc., is another way of expressing or understanding that wholeness, which is greater than the sum of all the parts of everything that is. That's another, like it's another way of looking to God, essentially, is that God, we can think of God as masculine, we can think of God as feminine, or other ways that we might think of God. But the idea that God creates, God is the creator, then almost necessarily puts God in a position like a motherly type of position. It's very beautiful. And it makes you feel better when you pray, sweetheart. It makes it better. I hope so. Okay, another question. It sounds like how Alcoholics Anonymous works. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I haven't been, but the piece you are describing, which the collective can create and bring to bear on the addictive process. Yes. And so, what we're being asked to do at this time in history is to come together collectively and bring our light to bear collectively on that kind of black hole stuff, like that sweet lady who she says she feels like there's a black hole within her. Yeah, that black hole is within you and without you. It's part of a larger structure in creation, and it's not there to be terrible and bad. It's there because the creator needs darkness in order to contrast with the light. Whatever level of darkness you see in yourself, you see it because you literally have the resources to deal with that darkness. And that resource is this thing that this other sweet person, this very nice person, mentioned of transcending or just diving deep down to a level of collective consciousness or self consciousness. We could say self with a big S, right? Self with a C, yes. The big self consciousness that is bigger than that level of darkness. And we all have access to it. But if we don't know we have access to it, or we don't intend to access it together, then what can we do? There's a saying from the Vedas, Richo Akshare Parame Vyoman, Yasmin Deva Adi Vishve Nishedu, Yastana Veda Kamricha Karishyati, Ya Istat Vidusta Ime Samasate. And what it essentially means is that the resources, the richas which reside in the field of absolute being, along with all the laws of nature, are accessible to a person who is awake within themselves. And if a person isn't awake within themselves, what can they do with that information? Nothing, essentially. But for a person who is awake within themselves and who does have access to that information, that person is established in evenness, peace. They're established in peace or evenness, which is the key to move through and navigate through all the different seasons of culture and humanity that we have chosen to live in. Beautiful, beautiful point about Alcoholics Anonymous. Thank you for offering that. What is the process would you recommend for me to do? Identify my birth country, national identity. So your individual, and her birth country is the Philippines. And I've been to the Philippines, so thank you for that question, because the fact that I've been there kind of helps me a little bit clue in and support that identification. But how many people do we have here? How many foreign nationals or people who've lived in other countries or are living in other countries? Very nice. Hands up all over the place. Very beautiful. Thank you. Thank you for being here and representing the collective consciousness in your area is so precious. So this question for all the people in all the countries. And so many Europeans are with us today. God bless the Europeans too. Your individual consciousness, like the cells that, remember I told you the story of this big stress that came out of every cell in my body, and it kind of like had its own like sense of a body, sort of, because there were some that came out of my eyes and some came out of my nose and all that. As individuals of a nation, we're like that too. We carry the essence of our nation. Or if you're really strongly attracted to live in a particular nation, that's because there's a part of your consciousness that really resonates or harmonizes with the consciousness of that nation. And so there's a part of the Philippines already in you. And the national identity of all nations does need to be founded on something that is universally life supporting for everybody, everywhere, in all the nations. So each individual nation needs as its foundation a principle that is equally life supporting for everybody everywhere, and for not only all of the citizens of its nation, but when that same foundation is found in another nation, it is also equally life supporting for the citizens of that nation and equally life supporting excuse me, for the relationship between the nations. Because when all the nations sit on the same platform, then all of a sudden it's like a quantum shift occurs that allows them all to unite together and create a wholeness, a global wholeness that is greater than the sum of its parts. Right now, what we have going on, or we have individuals saying, okay, like we're on the verge of some kind of global reality. So we are going to create our global elites. We're going to create our global elites and we're going to run this thing. But the problem is that as long as the nations are still fractured and divided, our global elites are going to reflect incompetence. Not to be rude, but it's only the true global unity comes from unity on the level of consciousness. So identify my birth country, Philippines national identity. The lady who wrote this question, this sweet lady, our Filipino friend, we can call her our Filipino friend. You know that the Philippines will always have a sense of national identity. And then its sense of self, or the way the Filipino nation identifies itself, can have a foundation of evolution, highest evolution. Just like if all the other countries, we're just going to say in an ideal world, all the countries' foundation, because like, okay, in America, the foundation's freedom. Well, freedom's great, but sometimes freedom can't, because it's not as fundamental as evolution, then what happens is, well, I'm an American, I stand for freedom, but my freedom conflicts with your freedom, and your freedom conflicts with my freedom and their freedom. And all of a sudden, you get this situation where America is divided against itself because our foundation as a nation is not something that is absolutely good for everyone. And it's not to say that freedom isn't going to be there, because freedom is actually part of the national identity. So we could say the national identity is a little more superficial, right? I mean, one would hope that all nations will provide some way for their people to live so that everybody feels everyone has the freedom to evolve. If you put evolution as the foundation, then that becomes, freedom becomes ingrained. Did Americans lose their foundation and adopt freedom instead? I don't know. But I do know that we all need to get it back. So for the Philippines, the Filipino people call themselves the butterfly people. It's one of the things I love so much about the Filipino people, because Butterflies are so beautiful and they're so delicate. They're such refined, they're almost like butterflies are like flowers without stems, aren't they? They go they go wafting by and they're so colorful and their wings are like little petals and it's so beautiful. And the Filipino people are like that, peaceful, right? Very, very peaceful people, very, very kind people, not out to, it's not like they don't call themselves the lion people. They call themselves the butterfly people because butterflies are nice. So, so those qualities that make the Filipino nation unique do not need to be lost. They become stabilized when the foundation is on the highest level, when the foundation aligns with the highest potential of the nation as a whole and of the people as individuals at the same time. Then the Filipino people will be the exquisite butterfly people of the world and will be a miracle of nature's creativity and beauty and glory. It fits perfectly with the principle or the premise of putting evolution as the foundation. Because if we define evolution as taking a form that best expresses the divine, right? Divine expression. If we define evolution as ever moving toward divine expression, well, how perfect is a butterfly? It's just such a miracle of nature's functioning, right? Such a divine. Butterflies are used as symbols of the divine because they fly. They fly up, they fly above problems. They fly, that principle of flight is one of the things that's, oh, it's just so beautiful. Oh, the Filipino people are so beautiful. All right. So let's see. I see we've come already to our time. I can't even believe it. But thank you for bearing with me through so much. Is there a beneficial and appropriate commitment of the cells to one another that helps them achieve their potential? Yes. Is this relevant, my dear? Though you who said this, it is so relevant. It is like the very essence of what I've been thinking about since yesterday. And that is that at each level of coordination or unification, you could say, of individuals to systems, and then those systems meet other systems and they unify to larger systems. And so there are some boundaries that also come into play. Some law, you can call them laws of nature. Laws of nature are boundaries, essentially, and that shape the environment and the world. And the ability to know the rules of the game, essentially, like social boundaries, right? There's certain things that are socially appropriate and certain things that aren't. And the better a person is at deciphering out and identifying what is socially appropriate and what isn't, the smoother time they have making their way in this world and getting along with others, the more respect they garner from their fellow citizens and so forth. And if somebody is not very sensitive to boundaries, so they tend to do and say things that are inappropriate and so forth, it's harder for them. It's harder for them in this world. They're less likely to successfully find closeness and relationship. So boundaries are important, and the boundaries change at each level of expansion. And so that's part of what makes the winter and what makes it hard, is having to decipher out as we transition into kind of a larger sense of global community, finding out what really are those rules and where are those boundaries and how can we quickly integrate and adopt them. But the value of winter is that everything is stripped bare and we get to see. There's a kind of crisp clarity, isn't there, in the air, especially when it gets really cold. Where we live in Iowa, we've missed the really deep freeze cold that we used to get here years ago, but further north, I think you guys are getting that in Canada. And so you get that deep freeze. It's like everything freezes, even viruses and bacteria in the air and mold and everything freezes. And as it does so, the air becomes very clear. And the clarity, it doesn't matter if you live in a warmer climate or if you live in a cooler climate. The important thing is that the nature of winter is to provide clarity, among other things. And the clarity creates a context. It's very, very easy for awareness to dive inward and to see all the, excuse me, see all those underlying mechanics and mechanisms that are responsible for the way the world shows up. I hope this was useful. I really was thinking that we would get into the, oh, thank you for the lady from the Philippines. Good, I'm glad that was useful. I was hoping that we would get even more into the mechanics of the gap, even more into how does the consciousness move down there in such beautiful, subtle ways. But perhaps that can be a topic for another webinar. That would be nice if we could. Anyway, thank you everyone for the beautiful questions today and for your precious presence. And I hope I managed to get to pretty much all of them. Most of them. All right. Thank you, everyone. It's been lovely to be with you. And just a little reminder, the next webinar is in only 2 weeks. And then we'll have a kind of a long Christmas holiday break, a long holiday break over here. So 2 weeks from now, I look forward to seeing you all again. And I believe we're going to look at karma 2 weeks from now, which should be very interesting. And as we do that, we may give a really nice opportunity to dive into that gap and look even more at the detailed mechanics. So it's even more the depth of winter, right? In 2 weeks, it'll be even closer to the very longest night of the year at those deep mechanics of what happens in that gap. So anyway, thank you for being with me. And was I correct? Is it the karma next? Okay, cool. I got it right. Okay. Thanks for being with me. Thanks for bearing with me, even though I'm not at 100%. But hopefully I'll be closer to 100% next time we see each other. It's always so lovely to be with all of you. Wishing you all a nice dive into the silence. Thank you. Bye-bye.